They say the Italian Hitchcock. I don't know about that. They're very, very different filmmakers, but he was very much associated with suspense, tension, and the macabre. And I think with Deep Red, there was just this realization of, okay, this is where I'm going to go. This is the kind of thing that people want from me. It was very calculated on that level.
Today we're going to be speaking to Troy Howorth, author of Murder by Design, The Unsane Cinema of Dario Argento. So let's get into it.
Hi, Troy. I just wanted to kick things off and just ask a little bit about Argento's background before he becomes a filmmaker. Like, how would you mind just getting into a little bit of the backstory for me?
Yes, he was the oldest of three children, born to a movie producer, well, initially distributor, who turned producer, named Salvatore Argento, and a very well-known, very highly regarded fashion photographer, Brazilian fashion photographer named Elder Lixardo. He was born in 1940, and had been interested in kind of horror and macabre and sort of genre stuff from the time he was a child. He recalled reading Edgar Allan Poe as a child. The big thing that made a huge impression on him, funnily enough, was a rather mild version of family opera from 1943 starring Claude. It was a Technicolor film from Universal, which he caught at a re-release in Italy in 1949 when he was 9 years old. And he's told stories about seeing this film. It made such a vivid impression on him. He and his brother, his younger brother, Claudio, who later became a producer, and his younger sister, who did not go into filmmaking at all, they all, would enact sequences from the film. It was something that really just kind of caught his imagination and fascinated him as a child. He was already into the world of Edgar Allan Poe, H.P. Lovecraft. So definitely had a keen interest in the macabre, but became very much a big cinephile, which makes sense because he was brought up in an environment which had to do with film and also with the world of fashion. He, again, would talk about being a little boy and allowed access to his mother's sort of fashion studio. He would go there after school and he would see all these beautiful actresses like Sophia Loren and various other people, during the 1940s and early 1950s when he was still a child. And they didn't think much about doing costume changes and things in front of him because he was just a little boy. They figured, well, little boy, he's not going to be too concerned with all this. But he said he was definitely took notice, and it did make a big impression on him. So he definitely had this kind of appreciation for the world of the aesthetic and the world of fashion, but also the world of film because of his father's background. By the time he was about 17 in the late 1950s, he decided that he wanted to start writing about film specifically. He didn't really want to become a journalist per se, but he wanted to become a film critic specifically. He actually lied. He said, if this is true or not, I don't know. This is the story he tells. He lied about his age because you had to be legally the age of 21 in Italy at that time to hold down a job without your parents' permission. So he lied, said that he was 21, got a job with a newspaper in Rome, and from there was able to get a job with the communist newspaper, very left-leaning newspaper called Paese di Sera, which is very significant because Paese di Sera is going to crop up in several of Argento's films, including his very first one. We see Renato Romano and Tony Massante buying copies of Paese di Sera at the beginning of the film. So obviously that was a very important thing for him, getting into that world and being able to start writing about film. But he was a little bit controversial amongst his peers, partly because he was very young, but also because he had no qualms really celebrating what were regarded as kind of low-level, not terribly serious filmmakers like Mario Bava and Sergio Leone at a time when these people were not taken seriously in the Italian film scene. So he wrote about them with as much enthusiasm and as much gusto as he would write about a new film by Visconti or Fellini, for example. And he was also a very big fan of Hollywood films, which again was not kind of the thing. European intelligentsia at that time, Paese di Sera, of course, again, it's a communist publication. things tend to be very, very politicized in that environment. And Argento was indeed, not a literal card-carrying communist, but he definitely had communist sympathies and was very much interested in that. As a matter of fact, he told a story about going to the beach with his parents at one point, little family vacation. And at some point there was an election going on, and just to make small talk, the father said, "Well, who are you voting for?" And Dario came out and said, "Well, actually, I'm a communist." Apparently, father nearly wrecked the car. Mother, whom he described as being a fascist, he had a very complicated relationship with his mother, was appalled. So, there was definitely a great sympathy with the communist movement and with very left-leaning politics, which, I mean, you can see in his films. It's very clear once you kind of know it's there. It's very obvious. But getting into that world, writing about films, taking a more even playing field view, where it's not just the very politically committed filmmakers from Italy at that time that were interesting to him, but also people who were very kind of apathetic about politics, like Leone, for example, in making films that were genre films. So, that was something that was very unusual for him at that time, certainly compared to his peers. And he gradually started getting more and more opportunities to interview big figures, in some cases, people who were kind of idols to him, like Fritz Lang. Fritz Lang was one of the big influences on Dario Argento. He was able to interview Fritz Lang, John Huston, Mario Bava, Sergio Leone, even actors like Christopher Lee. When Lee was in Italy making a film called Castle of the Living Dead, Argento was on the set and he was able to interview him. From there, the very well-regarded writer, director, actor, Alberto Sordi was involved in making a film called Excuse Me, Are You For or Against?, which was all about the topic of divorce in Italy. I don't know if a lot of people realize that divorce did not become legalized in Italy until late in 1970. So this was a very controversial topic at the time. Sordi knew Argento, was aware of the fact that he wanted to get into writing scripts. So not only just giving him a small role in the film, but giving him an opportunity to kind of sit with the writers, observe and see how things were done, in terms of writing scripts, at least the Italian way, which is rather different from the American way. Gave him an opportunity to kind of be a fly on the wall and see how these things were done. And then when that experience happened, it wasn't long after that he ran into Sergio Leone at the premiere of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly around Christmas time of 1966. And it was Leone that came to Argento and said, "Hey, do you want to help out with writing the story for my next film?" which became Once Upon a Time in the West. And from there, as they say, everything kind of takes off.
I just want to jump back for just a quick second just to ask, what is writing the Italian way? How would you describe that?
It's probably, compared to the American style of writing scripts, it probably seems a somewhat chaotic environment where very often there is a group of people that are involved. There are indeed certain very well-established, very well-regarded screenwriters who could be relied upon to actually sit down, develop a script, and write it in a kind of quote-unquote conventional way. But very often when it came to writing a lot of these films, especially comedy-type films like the Alberto Sordi film in question, you would have a group of people that would kind of be spitballing ideas back and forth. So Argento had the opportunity at that time to sit there and watch the writers as they went back and forth, discuss various ideas. Things would be shot down, accepted, developed, and he had an opportunity to see that, which actually was a very good experience because that's pretty much exactly the way that the writing of the story for Once Upon a Time in the West would end up going as well.
All right. And so from there, obviously, Once Upon a Time in the West, incredible movie. How long does it take for Argento to eventually get like the directing bug, like the itch to direct?
Well, he had no interest in directing at first. His goal was to be a screenwriter. He loved the idea of writing because it's a solitary profession. Argento is rather a introverted person in many respects. So the idea of kind of being on a set, marshaling a crew, dealing with actors was not something that was very appealing to him. And he really didn't have any ideas of doing that until around 1969, when he writes the script for Bird with the Crystal Plumage. That's a whole kind of story in and of itself. But essentially what happened is that, he meets on Once Upon a Time in the West Bernardo Bertolucci, who is also brought in by Sergio Leone to help develop the story for Once Upon a Time in the West. He wanted to get a kind of youthful, different perspective in writing the story because he was used to writing with the same people over and over again. They developed the story, but the script is indeed written by one of Leone's typical collaborators, Sergio Donati. I think there's some confusion because a lot of people will talk about Argento writing the film. He didn't write the film. He didn't write anything to do with the actual film. He helped to develop the story. But during that process, obviously, he contributed ideas. He had the opportunity to work with Bertolucci and formed a friendship with Bertolucci. And Bertolucci apparently was the guy that gave him the book, The Screaming Mimi, which was a kind of pulp thriller, an American thriller written by a writer by the name of Frederick Brown. It actually had been made back in the 1950s by Gerd Oswald, who was very heavily involved in The Outer Limits, I believe. But he read this script, he read this book rather, thought it was a good idea, and kind of took various elements from it and developed it into a screenplay for what would become The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, which, originally it was another script. It was a thriller script, a Giallo, as I'm sure we'll talk about. But because he was so happy with the way the script turned out, he was very concerned because taking it to his father to help try and get it off the ground as a production, he was finding that the head of Titanus, one of the big production companies in Italy at that time, wanted to give it to a director like Terence Young. Now, Terence Young was the guy who directed the first two James Bond films, and he came back and did Thunderball. And he had recently had a big hit with Wait Until Dark, which is a terrific adaptation of a very popular stage play. But Argento rightly reckoned that Young wasn't the right director for it. And he thought, the only person I could really see doing this the way I want it done is me. So he was able to talk his father into backing that and making it happen. And quite frankly, had it not been for his father's clout and his father's willingness to kind of go to bat for him, I don't know that would have happened.
And luckily it did. As much as I love Wait Until Dark, I just feel like Terence Young's style is just a little too just kind of static and just not very, a lot of those early Bond films are very just unexciting visually. And just to see like what Argento obviously does with Plumage and just his style in general, it's like I don't want to see a very static, very staid version of that film.
Yeah, I mean, I actually really do like Terence Young's three Bond films. I think they're really elegant and very well done. But Wait Until Dark is a great example of a kind of a fireproof script, a fireproof setup. It's not so much how it's directed, although he does pull off one great jump scare. Everybody remembers that jump scare at the end with Allan Arkin. I'll give him credit for that. But for the most part, it is fairly dry. And Terence Young was somebody who, back in the late 40s when he started off directing, was making really interesting kind of slightly avant-garde films like Corridor of Mirrors, which was actually Christopher Lee's first film. He has a small part in that. It was his very first film. But he kind of got into doing these kind of bigger international productions. He started making really lousy films like The Klansman and Inchon and various other things. So even in the early 70s, he did a couple of Charles Bronson films, which on paper should be really good, but they're not that good. And it largely is because of him. So yeah, thank goodness. I don't think that Terence Young would have brought that same vitality to it.
Not at all. And so as Argento's gearing up, I'm interested to see if, like, obviously coming from a critical background and an appreciation of film, as well as writing, does he come into this film a little more fully formed, like stylistically, like knowing what he wants to do, or is it kind of a baptism by fire?
I'd say it's baptism by fire. He said that a lot of things that people said were so innovative were just because he didn't know any better. He was working with a top-class cinematographer, Vittorio Storaro. There again, the Bertolucci connection, because Storaro shot a lot of films for Bertolucci. He was by no means a novice at this time, but he was fairly early on in his career. This is pre-Apocalypse Now, and various other, major productions that he would do later on. But I think he knew that there was this kind of run of Giallo films that had started coming out of Italy in the early 1960s, first with Mario Bava. Then there were several other directors who kind of chimed in. And then in the late 60s, we saw this run of kind of sexy Giallo films that were all kind of indebted to Diabolique. So they were rather different kind of proposition. But Argento, he didn't invent this form, and he wasn't the first one to do the kind of body count Giallo. Bava did that, earlier in the 60s. But he brought that kind of youth-oriented touch to it. One of the things I've always kind of pointed out in that film that really separates it from what somebody like a Bava or a Freda or a Margheriti would have done. You have a kind of young counterculture type hero, if you even want to call him that. He's kind of an ambiguous figure in some respects, played by Tony Musante. And if you look at the way that apartment that he lives in is decorated, and you'll see there's like a Black Power poster on the wall. None of those guys would have thought of that. They weren't part of that generation. So Argento definitely had his finger on the pulse. He was aware of the events of 1968. He was very, much into kind of the very leftist politics of the period of time. And he was interested in making something that would hopefully stand out from the crowd. And I think he succeeded. But did he have a really, really clear idea? I don't believe he really did. I think that he had kind of a sense of what he wanted to achieve, but to actually be there on the set and call the shots and figure out how to work the camera and how to kind of create these wonderful point of view shots and everything else, I think a lot of it was just kind of finding his footing as he went along.
I mean, that's good instincts on his part, just going along with that, and that's what you come out with. Like, whew, good for him. So just for the sake of the viewers at home, I'm just going to ask the question to you, and we're going to get into this a little bit more as we get deeper into Argento and when he starts to kind of really change things up. To you, what would you say defines a Giallo? Like, what is a Giallo? You don't have to get super in depth with it if you don't want to.
Well, the name literally means yellow, and it comes from a series of sort of lurid pulp thrillers that were published in Italy by a company called Mondadori, and they all had yellow slipcovers, hence Giallo. Giallo to the Italians is a very different term than it is to non-Italians. To Italians, it basically denotes a thriller. We could be talking Alfred Hitchcock, you could be talking Agatha Christie, it could be Raymond Chandler, it could be film noir. It's a thriller. For us, outside of that culture, that term has a much more specific kind of connotation. And I guess more properly in Italy, they would refer to this specific thing as Giallo all'Italiana, which is a thriller Italian style, which is to say films that are very lurid. They tend to be, they don't always have to be, but they tend to be either sexy or violent. Sometimes they're both. They don't have to have a series of murders. Sometimes it's more to do with sort of psychological machinations. Like I said, that series of films like Sweet Body of Deborah by Romolo Guerrieri, and the films that Umberto Lenzi made in the late 60s, and also even Lucio Fulci's first Giallo perversion story. They're not body count films, but they deal with kind of morally ambiguous characters who are playing head games with each other in order to get some kind of, usually money or property or both. But generally, they're stylized mystery thrillers with a very kind of pulpy bent. That's how I would describe them.
All right. Thank you for that. So I just want to jump ahead a little bit into his career. So he does the Animals trilogy, and it seems like he starts to pivot away from horror, from Giallo, from thriller. Yeah. He does, I believe it's the 5 Days, which is not horror, and then he moves into Doors into Darkness. Why is there a specific reason he starts to move away from it, and then is there a specific reason Doors happens?
So in order to put you into the bigger picture a little bit, it's one of the things that deserves to be emphasized that when Bird with the Crystal Plumage came out, it was very much like Halloween later in the decade. It was not an instant overnight hit. People tend to think that it was, but it wasn't. It was one of those movies that took a little while. Word of mouth built around Bird with the Crystal Plumage as it did later with Halloween. So eventually they became enormously successful, but they weren't right out the gate. And actually, right after Bird with the Crystal Plumage, he started working with a writer named Dardano Sacchetti, who a lot of people who love these films will know. He's responsible for writing a lot of Lucio Fulci's best-known horror films like The Beyond and Zombie, for example. They started writing a film which was going to be kind of an Italian variation on Easy Rider, a kind of counterculture youth film built around motorcycle culture. That didn't happen because Bird with the Crystal Plumage was so successful. He was kind of pushed into making another Bird with the Crystal Plumage, which became Cat o' Nine Tails. He had a very difficult time on that film, which for years he regarded as his worst film. He's kind of softened on it, but he had a very unpleasant time because the German co-producers were like, we want to jet set Bird with the Crystal Plumage. So in other words, what you did before, but now we want it elevated. We want it to be kind of, plush, lush scenery and settings and beautiful costumes and none of this kind of, struggling writer living in a kind of sparsely decorated loft, but we're going to have, everything be really super sort of chic and modern and shiny. That wasn't what he wanted. The film ended up being a bit of a compromise, but it was very successful. After that, he does Four Flies and Grey Velvet. It was never really intended it was going to be a trilogy. But because Bird with the Crystal Plumage had been so successful, there was this whole run of Giallo films that came out in the early 1970s, especially through like 1972, 73, where you had movies like Bloodstained Butterfly, Iguana with the Tongue of Fire, Lizard in a Woman's Skin, Don't Torture a Duckling, Black Belly of the Tarantula. They all name check some sort of animal or insect in the title. So Argento just kept going with that. But he was a little put off that all these people were making films kind of piggybacking on his own success. To be fair, not all of them could be called ripoffs. I think the ones that Fulci did, for example, are very, very different from the ones that Argento did. Did they come to be because of Argento's success? They did, but he didn't just copy them. So there is something to be said for that. On the other hand, there were some kind of copycat films that were really good. Paolo Cavara's Black Belly of the Tarantula, for example, was very much like an Argento film, but it's really good film. So some of them were good, some of them were bad. Obviously, people were starting to get a little bit fed up. There were so many of these things being made, and Argento thought, I'm just going to kind of rethink how I'm going to approach this. This is not sustainable. I'm going to step away from it and try to do something else. What comes first is actually Door in Silence. That comes about in 1972. But then in 1973, he does The 5 Days, which was not a film that he originally was going to direct. He was going to produce it, but the original director stepped away, and Argento was just kind of the most logical person to step in and direct it. It's the only movie he's done to date that is completely disconnected from the horror and kind of suspense genre. It's historical black comedy. Deals very much with a very specifically Italian topic. And of course, it had zero interest in the international marketplace. It never had any kind of international distribution. It never even came out over here in the US officially until within the last few years when Severin put it out on 4K. Prior to that, it was not officially, bootlegs were around, of course, but there was never an official VHS or DVD or Blu-ray release until that came along. So it was a big film. It was an expensive film, but it didn't do very well. So, of course, that results in him going back to the Giallo with Deep Red. But when he does Deep Red, it really feels to me like he's saying, I'm going to make the Giallo to end all Gialli. I'm going to make the best, the biggest, the most stylish, the most audacious. And I think he did with Deep Red. But, of course, that creates a situation for him as well, because where do you go from there? So, once again, he kind of shifts gears after that.
jumping back to his excursion into television, I just want to know like a little bit more about the background of the show, about how he ends up doing a television series, what like the process was for that.
So he was one of those relatively rare directors who managed to make his name and his face known to the public. And this show was very important in that regard because, there are directors like Mario Bava, for example, who were very publicity shy. And anytime they gave interviews, they tended to kind of downplay themselves and act like they weren't particularly talented because they didn't want that kind of attention. Argento wanted to become a big name, and he set out to do that, and he succeeded. 1972 was kind of a tumultuous time for him. First of all, it's worth noting that Cat o' Nine Tails comes out in February of 71. Four Flies comes out in December of 71. It's the only time in his career he has two films playing in theaters in the space of a single year. He never does that again. They're both very successful. His name is known very well. His name is large on posters. The new thriller by Dario Argento. He's bona fide like a big name. He's a young guy. He's only in his 30s, which made some of the older veterans a little jealous. A lot of them, and not unfairly, would say, well, it's only because his dad's a producer. That's true to an extent, but he had the talent to back it up. So it wasn't just that. But he had become well known, and what happened was the RAI network, which at that time was kind of the Italian TV station. Things changed later in the late 70s into the early 80s, and this is what happens with the whole Italian film scene, which kind of collapses because of the rise of television. Various different networks crop up, and movies start to become available to be seen for free on TV, which really has a big impact negatively on film production. But RAI at that time realized, Argento's a big name. He has a bona fide celebrity. Let's cash in on this. So they suggest the idea of a series of short films for television. They commissioned 4. They shot from through the late part of August of 1972 into the second half of October of 1972. In order, there was The Tram, which was the first one to be shot. That's one that Argento directs himself, although he doesn't credit himself. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. After that, his friend and collaborator Luigi Cozzi does The Neighbor. Then Mario Foglietti, who had co-written Four Flies and Grey Velvet with Cozzi, directs The Doll. And then Argento's regular AD, Roberto Periante, does Eyewitness. They are then broadcast in, let me see here, September of 1973. So they come out, they end up being, very, very successful with the public. And it has kind of the same impact and the same effect that had for Alfred Hitchcock in the U.S. with Alfred Hitchcock Presents, where all of a sudden this director whose name was known, he's associated with a very particular type of film, but now we know his face, we know his voice. It makes him into a bona fide celebrity. And that's exactly the thing that helps to kind of push Argento into becoming, more than just a quote unquote mere filmmaker, but he ends up becoming, a bona fide recognizable celebrity in the bargain.
Why wouldn't he be credited on the episode?
So he decided to go ahead and credit himself with the name Sergio Bernadotte. I don't entirely know why he picked that name, but the reason was he was concerned that having started off making films for the big screen, that making a TV film might be seen as kind of a step backwards. So he decided to go ahead and use a pseudonym for that film. It doesn't really make a great deal of sense to me in the sense that Hitchcock had done the same thing and had signed numerous episodes that he directed of Alfred Hitchcock Presents. So, it's not necessarily the most sensible or the most logical decision that he could have made, but that was the decision that he stuck to. And he ends up directing that one particular episode officially, although he does end up participating also in the shooting of Eyewitness as well, when Roberto Periante proved to not really be up to the task.
And I feel like out of all of the episodes, you can absolutely tell what he did, especially the final stretch of The Tram. Just
oh yeah,
that and he's I feel like potentially he might have been experimenting more with like editing techniques on television and whatnot, but there's a lot of interesting things he does, mostly in that chase sequence. There's obviously like the wide angle like tunnel push when it's just chasing after the actress running away from the camera. She keeps slipping, but then he keeps doing this interesting thing where she keeps moving around the train while being pursued, and it keeps cutting away to random objects and things. It just really, like when I was watching it was really throwing me off. And obviously I would like to touch on this a little more once we get into Phenomena, because I feel like there's a lot of similar things he does throughout. But just this idea of cutting like seemingly unmotivated cutaways that I feel like actually enhance the tension. And right. I don't know if this is something you've looked into or you've really like thought about, or if this really sticks out to you.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Well, I mean, one of the things to bear in mind with this is compared to his films, these were done very, very quickly. These were done, each segment was allotted 12 days. They didn't all quite work out that way. Coetzee finished his segment in 9 days. Whereas the Folietti episode went over schedule, so there ended up having to be some second unit stuff being done to bring things up to speed. But 12 days is not much time when you're used to having more luxurious shooting schedules. Bird with the Crystal Plumage had been a relatively low-budget film, not super low budget, but compared to later films, it wasn't particularly lavish. They got bigger and bigger as he went along. So this was a good opportunity for him to kind of experiment. The kind of editing you're talking about was something he was already experimenting with gradually in his films. If you look at Bird, it's fairly straightforward as the filmmaking goes. I still think Bird is not a bad intro point for Argento in general, because it's obviously Argento, but it's not quite as weird as some of the later stuff, and that might be easier for people to kind of ease in that way. But then beginning with Cat o' Nine Tails, and then especially in Four Flies, he's starting to experiment a lot with really interesting avant-garde editing techniques, flashing forward and backward, cutting to weird sort of little cutaways. And I think all the cutaways just have to do, as you say, with just sort of building the tension. That last stretch of the story is indeed, I think it's a little tour de force. It really is. It's beautifully executed. It's where everything kind of goes off the hook. The music becomes really loud and aggressive in a way that the music is not typically throughout the episode. You get this really driving percussive score. But he also uses this sometimes, cutting into our protagonist, Giordani, played by Enzo Cherusico, who would go on to play one of the leads in the 5 days, by the way. To kind of illustrate his thought process, he's always cutting to his fingers, this nervous gesture of clicking his fingers. So these are little ideas that kind of add to the texture, but in a weird way, they disorient the viewer, and I think really do add to that sense of tension.
All right, and so after these two films, like Deep Red is next, and Deep Red is obviously a massive deal, just in terms of his career and his style. What brings him to this? What brings him back fully to Giallo?
It was the failure of the 5 days, essentially. The 5 days was not the type of film that could afford to be rejected by the Italian public, and that's what happened. Argento found himself in his mid-30s, very, very closely associated with a very particular type of film. And so I think he kind of came to realize, okay, this is going to be my lot. This is what's going to happen. I'm going to be the Italian. They say the Italian Hitchcock. I don't know about that. They're very, very different filmmakers, but he was very much associated with suspense, tension, and the macabre. And I think with Deep Red, there was just this realization of, okay, this is where I'm going to go. This is the kind of thing that people want from me. It was very calculated on that level. The 5 days, which had shot in the summer of 1973 and came out in time for Christmas of 73, just didn't go over. People didn't like it. It's a good film. Now that it's readily available, I would recommend people pick it up. It's I think, rather a poignant film. It's a little clumsy in parts. There are things about it that don't work. but it's his most overtly political films, very cynical. It obviously is the work of a man who, like a lot of his contemporaries, a lot of these people who are making genre films during this period of time, you're dealing with people like John Carpenter, Tobe Hooper, George Romero, Wes Craven, and Argento. They're younger guys who are kind of disillusioned ex-hippies. The dream of the 60s kind of died in 1968, and then from there things got darker and darker and darker. So we see these films starting to come out, which really kind of, in some cases, deliberately kind of satirize that dream of a utopia that's turned into a nightmare. In Argento's case, his films are not as openly political, but again, it's there. If you choose to look at it very often, the negative element in his films are kind of embodied by characters who are part of the upper crust of society. So that's something that makes it pretty clear where his sympathies are with, as opposed to other characters who are very often who are kind of disenfranchised or are minority type figures, and he has very sympathetic depictions of gay characters, for example, in a way that was very progressive for the 1970s. But Deep Red was, I think, most definitely his attempt to kind of reestablish himself as the reigning king, and it worked exceptionally well because the movie was a huge hit at the Italian box office.
All right, and then after he does Deep Red, it's a huge hit. There seems to be a major stylistic shift because Suspiria is next.
Mm-hmm.
And it is unlike anything that comes before. And obviously he's a massive Bava fan. I'm not sure if there's any kind of correlation between his love of Bava and like the shift in style, or like how he comes upon Suspiria. Like, how does he reach this point?
So that's always been a little bit of a bone of contention in terms of, who really came up with the idea. One of the big things that happens on Deep Red is he meets an actress, a theater actress and film actress by the name of Daria Nicolodi. Daria Nicolodi becomes Argento's lover. They're together. They have a harmonious relationship through the making of Deep Red, into the writing of Suspiria. But then when the time came to make Suspiria and Nicolodi didn't get the role that she thought she was going to get, the role that she effectively said she wrote for herself, things went south. And they were never actually married. People often say that they were married. They weren't. But they lived together off and on, and they had a daughter, Asia Argento, of course, went on to become a very famous actress and director in her own right. But Nicolodi always said that a lot of it came from her own background. She hailed from Florence. Her grandmother supposedly had studied at a dance academy that had some sort of weird occult kind of connotations, and these stories had been passed on to Nicolodi, and she kind of suggested to Argento, who was looking for an opportunity to try something different. He didn't want to just keep doing Giallo films all the time, but he knew that having tried something like The 5 Days, what am I going to do? How about a supernatural horror film? So she kind of indicated that's where it came from. He always pointed to his love of, sort of esoteric literature, specifically in this case, Thomas de Quincey, Confessions of an Opium Eater, and had written an essay which involved these characters of the three mothers. Regardless of who came up with it, a story that was very basic and is very much kind of a fairy tale was crafted. Believe it or not, it was originally written with the idea that it would be based around kids. They realized that wasn't going to work because it was going to be far too violent, so they changed it to a dance academy where the members were adults, and it became this incredibly kind of psychedelic, experimental kind of process of using 3-strip Technicolor printing and processing to bring out these incredibly vivid colors, very stylized settings. I mean, it's there in Deep Red, but it's taken to an nth degree in Suspiria. And then, of course, after Suspiria, it comes back and does Inferno, which is continuing the same mythology with a very similar kind of stylistic bent. They were huge. They were very, very successful at the box office. They were very popular with audiences. And so, for those, even though compared to, well, I shouldn't say the Suspiria was a happy experience. On the whole, it really wasn't, because his relationship was falling apart with Nickelodeon. He actually did contemplate committing suicide during that period of time. So he went through some rather dark periods during that film. But Inferno was a particularly unpleasant experience for him. And for years, it was a movie that he always regarded rather with a kind of a sour disposition, although he's come to embrace it. But these were concerted attempts to distance himself from the world, the more rational in quotation marks, world of Giallo, as opposed to the world of just out and out supernatural horror.
All right, and I want to get into that, but I just wanted to ask briefly, what for both Suspiria and Inferno, you said they were particularly difficult. Obviously, there's the emotional, like the personal stuff, but creatively, was he still unfulfilled by them?
Well, I don't know that he was feeling unfulfilled. I mean, he was having this, extraordinary run of success. If you look at everything that he did throughout the 1970s, with the exception of the 5 days, they were all big box office hits, and that would continue into the 1980s. He had a production company with his father and his brother, Seta Spettacoli, which not only produced his own films, but produced other films as well. They also had a hand in producing Dawn of the Dead for George Romero. You mentioned Bava before, and whether there was any influence there. I mean, Argento has always spoken well of Bava's films, but has kind of downplayed the idea of Bava being a big influence on him. He's always pointed specifically to Fritz Lang and Hitchcock and Ingmar Bergman as his big points of inspiration, and Sergio Leone, which I think that's all valid and true. But I think the really delirious stylized use of color, I think that's definitely something that he did pull at least a little bit from Bava, possibly also from Powell and Pressburger, which also, there are other filmmakers that he referred to, the great Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger during the 1940s and 50s made these Technicolor fever dreams like Black Narcissus and The Red Shoes. And The Red Shoes, you can definitely see a link between The Red Shoes and Suspiria. Absolutely. If you're so inclined. So that's all part of it as well. But I think he was really flying high. I mean, during this period of time, he's a bona fide celebrity. Everybody knows his name. He achieved a level of success in Italy throughout the 70s and 80s, which was really akin to like a rock star, which is very unusual. I don't know that there is an American kind of parallel to that precisely.
All right. And you had also mentioned just this pullback from reality. Yeah. And obviously from Bird with the Crystal Plumage, it's a very, very grounded film. And it feels like obviously there's little sprinklings of like surreal flourishes and odd ticks here and there. And then Suspiria kind of kicks it all off. But does he have a reason to really kind of part from reality at this point?
I think more than anything, it was just an attempt to kind of, flourish a little bit more and try different things. I mean, I think directors in general, or artists in general, who become linked with a very specific kind of field very often want to show that they have the ability to do other things. I think that, within the world of the Giallo, Deep Red took things about as far as they could stylistically. And I think in a way, this kind of phantasmagoria was the next logical step, if you think about it. I mean, he couldn't have really taken it any further than he did with Deep Red. But if he cast off the shackles of reality and you don't have to worry about explaining things anymore and everything can just be down to magic, that just makes it that much easier. And it was kind of similar to what ended up happening with Lucio Fulci as well, who comes again from making rather more realistic Giallo films before getting into this run of incredibly surreal supernatural horror films. So I think in a way it was just kind of a natural progression.
Okay. All right. And so after Inferno happens, there's then another pivot. We have Tenebrae, and that feels like another complete stylistic overhaul. Suddenly we're losing these garish colors, and we are focusing on a shadowless like horror. There's just bright light. Everything is clean. It looks like a fashion ad with a lot of blood. And it just feels like another he jumps back into a fairly straightforward Giallo, even though he's still bringing to it a lot of interesting and surreal flourishes. And I just wanted to talk a bit about that shift and his approach here.
Well, I think that was specifically down to the fact that Inferno had been such a very unpleasant experience. He had some health problems during the film. Apparently, he had come down with hepatitis at one point, and was bedridden. There were, ongoing relationship issues with Daria Argento, who's in the film, but who you will note comes to a bad end in the film, and this becomes kind of a recurring thing in the next films that she appears in for him. As their relationship was disintegrating, the way she's presented in these films kind of disintegrates as well. And also because there had been a shift. 20th Century Fox acquired Suspiria and became involved in Suspiria as kind of a silent partner, helping to finance the film. This is why Jessica Harper stars in the film instead of Daria Argento, who had wanted to play the role of Sarah herself, or of Susie, I should say. She was offered the kind of, compensation role of Sarah, but she apparently wasn't interested, and everything just became very unpleasant. When they decided to go ahead and distribute it in the U.S., they didn't quite know what to make of it. I think they were a little bit embarrassed by it, so they created this this kind of subsidiary company called International Screen Classics, but it was Fox eventually put it out. It was a huge hit. It wasn't just a big hit in Europe, it was a big hit in Asia, it was a big hit in America as well. I don't think people realized that for a while, Suspiria was like the most requested movie to be released on home video, because it didn't come out on video in the US until I think around 86 or 87. Magnum put it out on VHS and Laserdisc, so it was a big deal when that came out. But then Inferno was, explicitly involved Fox, and Fox was to handle the distribution of the film. But it was one of those situations where the guys in charge changed, and the new people that came in didn't like the movie, and they treated it poorly, and it was just a miserable experience for him. So on the one hand, he's making a film that seems like it's going to be a continuation of the Mother of Tears, the Three Mothers mythology, because Tenebrae, Major Tenebrarum, seems like it's going to inevitably be the third part, but it's not. Not only that, but the title itself, which means shadows, is, as you say, it's a movie that's set in bright sunlight. Even the nighttime scenes are deliberately overlit. There's nowhere for anything to hide. So everything is very sort of glittering, and these kind of cool pastel colors, which are very 1980s, which carries over into Phenomena stylistically, although that film has a slightly different look to it. It's not quite as stark as this one. But in addition to sort of saying, okay, I don't want to go back into that world of witchcraft, I have a feeling it's bad luck. I've had nothing but miserable experience with Inferno. I'll go back to the Giallo. But he decides to make his most meta Giallo ever, which is, kind of an attempt to kind of engage with the critics who were accusing him of making films that were misogynistic and films that were socially irresponsible. And don't you feel terrible putting all these violent images out there? And what does that do to people? And he makes this very playful and kind of perverse kind of back and forth with the critics in Tenebrae, which it revolves around the idea of a writer of thriller stories, played by Anthony Franciosa, who goes to Rome to promote his latest novel, which is called Tenebrae. And becomes embroiled in a series of murders. There's all kinds of twists and a very dark, bleak ending. It's a remarkable film. I mean, if Deep Red was as far as you could take it in some respects, he found another kind of side avenue to take it in terms of the meta aspect. So for me, it's definitely one of his greatest films.
It's absolutely my favorite of his films, of all of the ones that I have seen. And again, like just removing shadows and removing like any kind of association with this garish lighting, it feels like he is challenging himself and he is showing off. Like he gets like the Luma crane. He starts doing these insane point of view tracking shots where it's just moving across the entire length of a house and over to another thing. And it's just, it feels like he is firing on all cylinders in this film, and it is a sight to behold. And I feel like it honestly, it does feel like he's at least as a director, in a much better place than he was after Inferno, just from what he's doing and what he's able to do. And you can clearly tell he is just showing off, and it's working. But
showing off in the best possible way. And for a movie that, I mean, it is a dark movie. Visually, it's not, but, you know, in terms of its tone and in terms of its kind of, you know, story arc, it is very dark. But it has, there is a kind of warmth to some of the characters, and there's a humor to it. And some of the interactions between the characters. And Anthony Franciosa, I think, is a wonderfully kind of sympathetic lead figure. And Giuliano Gemma is the detective who has a love for mystery stories, and you know, there are these characters who you really do feel kind of emotionally invested with, but at the same time, it's also it's deliberately ridiculous and ridiculously over the top in a way that is something that bothers some people. I mean, this is not the type of mystery thriller that works for the Agatha Christie crowd, you know, where they want everything all sort of neatly tied up at the end. There are things that happen for no real discernible purpose, except that he knows it's going to be a great sequence. I'm totally okay with that, but some people don't like that. And it's an aspect that makes his movies, I think, a hard sell for a lot of people, especially people who are kind of indoctrinated into, especially the way we're taught to think about films in Western culture. We tend to think of it as an outgrowth of literature, which it can be, but it doesn't have to be. So he's very playful here. And you're right. It is like he's saying, I want to show that I can do something different. So he's always kind of trying to push himself, which he continues to do with Phenomena, and really does in opera, where he takes this kind of stylistic stuff about as far as he could possibly go.
And I'm just thinking about the way there are certain aspects in the performances and dialogue, and namely Suspiria and Inferno, where it feels almost, if not deliberately absurdist. It's over the top. It's not what you would call good acting, but it's very theatrical. It's very kind of off-putting. And then in Tenebrae, there are some ridiculous things, but there are a lot of like really genuinely solid performances, and it is a tightly plotted film. And I feel like Argento usually gets labeled a hack, which is unfair, because when he chooses to go in one direction or another, it always feels deliberately calibrated in certain ways. And obviously we'll get into this a bit more with Phenomena, because that is a very particular film, but I don't know if there's anything you wish to speak of. I think we have touched on it with just that whole reality unreality approach, and also how Western films are just inundated with this idea that everything has to be realistic, which can be incredibly boring and limiting.
No, I just watched last night. I hadn't seen it for a long time. I watched a Jean Roland film called The Iron Rose, which is literally about two young people in a cemetery. That's it. That's your story, and there's nothing to it. But it is incredibly intoxicatingly beautiful and atmospheric. If you think a film has to be all about a story, if you think a film has to be about sort of psychological realism or depthy characters and things like that, you're probably going to say, why would I want to watch this? It's just, boring movie about two people wandering around the cemetery. I don't find it boring. I find it incredibly arresting, because it's done so very well. And I'd say the same thing about Argento, that, there's so many different ways we could take this conversation, but this idea that, directors like Argento and Bava and Fulci, they're just empty hacks. They know how to make pretty pictures, but they don't know how to tell a story. Is ridiculous. We can point to any number of films that all three of these men made that have good plotting and tell a story in a very coherent and cohesive fashion. That's not necessarily what they're always interested in. And it's not always what Fellini was interested in. It's not always what Leone was interested in. Very often it's about creating a world, creating a kind of atmosphere, a texture that is somehow unusual and stylized and very theatrically pitched. And so you'll have Argento films with performances that are, by any measure, perfectly competent. There's nothing wrong with him. He's not an actor's director. He's not Martin Scorsese or Sidney Lumet or Elia Kazan. He doesn't sit with actors and go through the psychology of the characters and get into that sort of thing. That's not what he does. But I think he gets good performances out of his actors. And I think sometimes, though, he wants something off. He wants something weird. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I don't use that as an excuse to say, well, you can't criticize anything in his films. He's made some bad films in more recent years. He's made a few films that I don't care for. He's made choices that I don't always necessarily agree with, but that's a very subjective thing. That's not a factual. That's just, that doesn't work for me. But this idea that he doesn't get good performances from his actors, I don't agree with that at all. I think if you look at people like Tony Massante and Bird with the Crystal Plumage, Carl Malden and Cat o' Nine Tails, David Hemmings and Deep Red, Anthony Franciosa and Tenebrae, they're terrific. They give great performances as far as I'm concerned. And the other actors in the films too. There might occasionally be somebody who's not quite up to the same level, but sometimes that's down to the dubbing. This is another aspect that's worth touching upon. Dubbing in Italian films was something that was very, very common. I believe they've gotten away from it a little bit more in recent years, but for many years it was unusual to have much in the way of live dialogue recording in Italian films. Bertolucci didn't like that because Bertolucci really valued what the actors were bringing to it, so he favored using actual, on-set sound recording. Added to which, just in general, movies do have a lot of dubbing later on. It's not uncommon for lines to have to be looped and all of that. But if you look at Suspiria, for example, with the English track, a lot of that is the actual on-set dialogue, you can tell. And that's also true with Phenomena as well. It's not always good. It depends. And it depends sometimes on what the actors are being asked to do. And sometimes there are things that are just, again, from a subjective point of view, maybe they work or maybe they don't. But I do think that he's good with actors in general. I think that by and large, his films have very good performances, at least as far as I'm concerned.
Indeed. And so that brings us to Phenomena. And it kind of has this reputation for being a very kind of unwieldy, very just strange movie. There are, I think, at least 3 cuts of this film.
Yes.
Recuts, and it's kind of, to me it seems like it has this reputation for just being almost a problem film where it's a director's vision was a little too wild and unwieldy. And I when I watch the film, I am still absorbed by it. I am still willing to go along with it. Obviously, there are weird little idiosyncrasies here and there that feel strange, and we can get into those. But I just wanted to ask you about the film's reputation and where it kind of sits.
Well, it's not unusual for Argento films to have multiple edits. Deep Red has at least 3 edits as well. The original Italian version is like at 2 hours and 6 or 7 minutes. Then there was an international cut, which ran about an hour and 45 minutes. And then the American theatrical release, which ran around, 98 minutes. So when you see reviews of Deep Red in places like the Leonard Maltin Film Guide, and he criticizes the movie for being incoherent, it's missing a half hour. So that happens. In the case of Phenomena, the original Italian version, which is, Argento's preferred cut, is 116 minutes. They tightened it up a little bit for export for 110. And then when New Line acquired it for the US, they cut it down to 83. That's a lot of footage missing. And that's obviously going to impact the story and the overall structure and flow of the movie. I think it's safe to say that it was probably Argento's most controversial film up until that time. I'm not going to count the 5 days because, quite frankly, until much later, I don't think most people were aware of that movie's existence. It was an Italian film on an Italian subject with an Italian cast. There was no attempt to make that available internationally. So I think the average certainly American fan, probably didn't know that movie existed until many years later. But in terms of his genre films, I think it was the one that really kind of tested people. And for a lot of people, it kind of represented the first chink in the armor, the first film that he made that really didn't quite work. My own relationship with the film has been very complex down through the years. It was the first Argento film I ever saw. I saw the American version called Creepers, which was 83 minutes on VHS sometime in the 1980s, and I had no idea what to make of it at the time. I was far too young. I couldn't really appreciate. All I knew was it was a horror movie with Donald Pleasence. So I was like, I'm going to watch it. And it was just gross, and it was weird, and the voices sounded a little funny, and the music was strange. And I was like, what is it? I couldn't make up my mind about it. And down through the years, I've gone from thinking it was one of Argento's worst films to coming around to it and liking it a lot. I would say it's a mid-tier Argento for me. I don't think it's one of his great films. I think the existence of films like Dracula, Mother of Tears, and Giallo makes me appreciate it a lot more because there were worse things, far, far worse things to come. It is his everything but the kitchen sink movie. You get a sense that this was an attempt to kind of throw it all in there, throw it all up against the wall and see what would stick. And that means, from my point of view, again, some people love it. Some people think it's one of his best films. For years, he used to say he thought it was his best movie, which I never understood. But he's changed that since. Sometimes he'll say it's Suspiria or it's Deep Red or it's opera or whatever. But for years, he was, oh no, Phenomena is my most personal movie. It's my best movie. I'm like, okay, if you say so. But it's such a weird, woolly, unwieldy beast of a movie. It's so strange. It took me a long time to kind of make peace with it. I do think if I were to look at Argento's filmography from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I'd say it's his weakest film of that period. But if we extend it into the 2000s, it looks a lot better. And it's a movie I like. I have a lot of affection for it. It is deliberately strange and weird and over the top and eccentric, and it's full of really strange ideas bumping up against each other. And not all of them work for me, but God bless him for trying.
Yeah. And again, stylistically, it feels like he's taking the style he's established in Tenebrae. It's much more, it's much smoother. It's much, again, it feels closer to a fashion ad. Again, Armani, I believe, did the costuming for it.
Yeah.
It has like a very kind of provincial, like, I don't know, like almost upper class German feel to it, if that even makes sense. But it feels like he's taking that style, that more commercial visual style, and then he's applying the strangeness of Suspiria. And you said Suspiria was originally meant to feature children, and this movie actually does feature children in a school. It feels like maybe he's kind of going back to that idea.
Yeah.
And it kind of works, and it kind of feels like, oh, that maybe that's what that would have been like. But there's also, before this, had he already produced the Demon films, or was that later?
So this was the first production of his own production company. He had split with his father and his brother, and had set up this company called DAC Film, Dario Argento Cinematografica, or alternately known as ADC Films. And this was the first production of that company. Their second production was Demons, and Phenomena and Demons were the last Argento films to have a real kind of exposure at the U.S. box office.
And it's also, I believe, this might be the first film where he's using a lot of like source music, a lot of pre-existing songs. Like we're suddenly getting Motorhead thrown into the middle of a scene.
Yeah.
And that's obviously been a point of contention depending on the cut we're seeing. I think they removed most of that for Creepers. I'm not too sure. I don't have the stomach for that cut. I can't do it.
I don't think they really, I mean, they fiddled with everything in the Creepers edit, but they did leave the music in because that was a big selling point. That was a big deal. in the mid 80s to have Iron Maiden and Motorhead and these other groups listed. And they were listed very prominently on, I remember the VHS case, they said featuring the music of, and they did the same thing with Demons. So that was actually a big deal. And it was a very canny commercial move on his part, because he knew that that would really appeal to the youth market. So obviously the kids, the young headbangers and stuff like that, they loved it. They embraced it for that reason. Question becomes, does it always work? And I'm not entirely sure that it always does in this film, but there are times where it does. But yeah, prior to this, I mean, he had worked with Ennio Morricone on his first few films. Then Giorgio Gaslini, who was a jazz musician, did Door to Silence and 5 Days, and started Deep Red. And Goblin came in, so Goblin pretty much took over that score. Did Goblin and Suspiria. Keith Emerson was brought in to score Inferno, and it was essentially Goblin that did Tenebrae, but because they didn't have a drummer at that time, they couldn't call themselves Goblin, but it was essentially Goblin. So here was an opportunity to have like original music. It's credited to Goblin, but it's not really Goblin. It was just because of the label they had to deal with. They could use the Goblin name, but it was Claudio Simonetti and Fabio Pignatelli who provided some original music for the film, along with like Terry Taylor and Bill Wyman, Brian Eno, Roger Eno. I mean, a bunch of people. Simon Boswell. I think this was Simon Boswell's very first film scoring assignment. They all just wrote like little pieces that are heard throughout the film. But bringing in the Iron Maiden, Motorhead, stuff like that was very, very essential in terms of really tapping into that youth market.
I'm just gonna say, outside of the Motorhead scene, none of the songs feel like they stick out quite as much as people say. At least to me, like it kind of it sets the tone and it works. I feel like he obviously incorporates music better in opera.
Yeah,
a lot better in opera.
Yeah,
but there are certain moments where it kind of feels like, oh, is that a miscue? Like, what is that? But it just feels like he's throwing off the vibe. It kind of works, at least for me, in a subjective level.
Well, it's funnily enough, the metal music in Phenomena is a lot better than the metal music in opera. It's just used better in opera because of the contrast between the classical music, the opera music, and the violence. Which has these kind of metal songs being played over them, which are decent, but they're not great. But the music in Phenomena is better. But to me, I think it's Motorhead that's played over a big scene that, to me, it just doesn't work. It should be a scene that's sad. It should be a scene that has some poignancy to it. And you've got this music throughout. It just doesn't. For me, it doesn't work. No. But on the other hand, the use of Flash of the Blade, for example, to me is extraordinary. I think that works really, really well.
And it, at least in opera, it has actual purpose to exist within the scene. Like, you can see why it's being used, why it's being played. I want to get into opera, and then I think we can stop there, because I feel like that's kind of a nice film that the style culminates in. Okay. But coming out of Phenomena, that was it particularly well received when it came out, or was it, obviously it's controversial because it wasn't, but financially, box office wise, did it kind of set him back, or was it at least still kind of a hit?
Well, it was a lavish production. It cost $4 million, which doesn't sound like anything now, but $4 million for an Italian film in 1984 when this film was shot. Of course, it's released in 1985. It was a good chunk of money, and it was his, first production through his new production company. So it was important. It should do well, and it did. It was exceptionally successful at the Italian box office. The shoot lasts from August to October of '84. It finally, comes out. Actually, speaking of the whole music thing, they even did 2 tie-in music videos to promote the film. Argento directed the one, which is called Jennifer, which is built around Claudio Simonetti's main theme for the film. And his assistant, Michele Soave, directed one called Valley, which is based around that beautiful theme that's at the beginning of the film by Bill Wyman and Terry Taylor. So there were 2 music video tie-ins, comes out in Italy on the 31st of January, 1985. came in at number 11 for the 1984-1985 box office season in Italy. I mean, it did comparable business to movies like Ghostbusters, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. So it was very, very successful. And then New Line acquired it. They actually got Jack Shoulder, who had just done Nightmare on Elm Street 2 for them, to supervise the American edit. They said it cut it down all the way to 83 minutes, put it out as Creepers. They put it out in August of 1985, and it did well. The reviews were lousy. I mean, especially in the U.S., the American critics were not impressed by this film at all. And you know, how can you really judge it when it's been cut down so severely? I mean, you know, the movie's kind of a little bit ropey to begin with, but you remove all that material and it just kind of, you know, it doesn't do it any favors. But it was very, very successful. So it was a good gamble on his part. And then, like I said, Demons comes right afterwards, which was a huge hit. Another one of those movies that was very, very successful. Caused a little bit of a rift between him and Lamberto Bava, because all the posters say Dario Argento presents in huge letters a film by Lamberto Bava. So everybody kind of thought it's Dario Argento's Demons, which in a way it is, but it's Lamberto Bava's film. But that movie was enormously successful. Then, of course, they do Demons 2, which also did well. It was successful, wasn't as well received, but it did well at the box office. And then, yeah, you get into Opera, which was like the ultimate kind of big, ambitious technical exercise.
And Opera just feels like a culmination of the style he's just been building, especially the last few films.
Mm-hmm.
And it, to me, feels like it really marries the strangeness like that he's been dealing with, while also it's a tightly plotted movie. To me, it is his best shot film. Like, that is one of, I just love the way it looks personally. But so he comes out of Phenomena. How does he get to this point? Like, where does Opera come from?
He's typically is thinking big. Every film he's doing, he's thinking big during this period of time. You know, one of the things that, you know, we didn't touch upon with Phenomena is the casting, and some of the ideas in terms of the casting were very interesting and would have made for very different films. Originally, for example, he wanted to have Lynn Ullman play Jennifer, and he wanted Liv Ullman, the great actress known for Ingmar Bergman films, to play the headmistress at the school. That didn't work out, so he gets Jennifer Connelly because she had done Once Upon a Time in America for Sergio Leone. Obviously, Argento had that relationship with Leone, as did his co-writer Franco Ferrini, who co-wrote Once Upon a Time in America. But also, even the character of McGregor, originally he tried to get Peter Ustinov, and he signed Orson Welles. Orson Welles was going to do it, but he was too unwell. He wasn't able to travel, so they ended up obviously getting Donald Pleasance, which no complaints. But, you know, again, thinking big, thinking large, ambitious, bringing in more and more special effects, bringing in the metal music, you know, trying to tap into that youth market. It's all about just kind of getting bigger and bigger and bigger, in the same way that Sergio Leone did in the 1960s. When you think about starting off with a kind of a low budget knockoff of a Japanese samurai film, specifically Fistful of Dollars is essentially a ripoff of Yojimbo, as we know, although Yojimbo also has its origins in other literary sources. So there's a whole circle there that we don't really need to get into. But he goes, and every film he makes gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think that's what Argento was trying to do as well. During this period of time, his movies were doing really well. They were regularly cracking the top 20 at the Italian box office. I mean, by comparison, people like Lucio Fulci, yeah, their movies did well, but they didn't do that kind of business in the Italian marketplace. They tended to do better internationally. Argento's films were very successful. So every time one of his films came out, it was a big deal. Opera was like the big thing. It was Argento's Christmas treat. It was supposed to come out December of 1988. This was going to be the big, ambitious super production, you know, the culmination of all the kind of technical experimentation. We're going to, you know, do all these incredible, crazy shots. Very, very ambitious. And it's all based really in his childhood memory of seeing Phantom of the Opera and loving that so much, deciding he was going to do his own very personal take on it. Ironically, he does another version of it later, a much closer, although very eccentric version with Julian Sands and his daughter Asia Argento in the late 90s, which very few people like. I'm one of the few. I like it, but most people don't. But that was another big, ambitious film that laid an egg. Opera, on the other hand, did very well. It was very successful at the Italian box office. The problem was that it didn't get that kind of international exposure. Orion had picked it up for distribution in the US. They had put together a trailer. They had cut down their own version of the film. It was all ready to go, and then they went belly up, bankruptcy. So it never came out and had that opportunity. I mean, opera is a movie designed to be seen on the big screen, and unfortunately, it just didn't have that exposure. So from there, things start to become a little bit rockier. The movies aren't being as successful. They aren't connecting as well. This includes also the films he's producing, like stuff he's producing for Michele Soavi. The Church did well. The Sect did not. And then he tries going over to America and making films here, and that didn't go well. And so, everything cycles. It has its time, and then it kind of dies off. But his big run as kind of a box office champion in Italy really does kind of come to an end with opera. He did, have a comeback with the Stendhal Syndrome, which did well, but it wasn't as successful.
All right, and before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask if you had any other specific things you feel like you would like to get into, or you would like to say, or any just interesting little tidbits.
Well, I mean, as far as my relationship with Argento and everything, obviously a few years ago I wrote the book Murder by Design, the unsane cinema of Dario Argento. Unsane coming from the American title, the very nonsensical American title for Tenebrae. They called it Unsane over here. So that book is available. Obviously, I've written numerous books on other Italian filmmakers and on the Giallo genre, So Deadly, So Perverse. There's a trilogy of books that I wrote about those particular films. But Argento remains, for me, one of the most, I think, original, innovative, and idiosyncratic and distinctive filmmakers of his generation, or any other generation if it comes to that. I don't agree with the general kind of philosophy that everything for him is downhill after opera. I think he did wonderful stuff after that throughout the 1990s. It gets a little ropier in the 21st century. But, these things happen. He got older, budgets kind of shrank, the amount of time that he had to make his films kind of shrank a little bit, and audience tastes changed. And I think, sometimes there were attempts to kind of connect him with what the youth market wanted, and he was just off in his thinking. Look at something like Dracula, for example. I think that was just a complete mistake in every possible way. But I give him credit because, he's well into his 80s now, and he's continuing trying to get films off the ground. He still has ideas and wants to put things up on screen. He has kind of, his image has changed a little bit from this kind of very neurotic, very haunted looking, macabre looking kind of figure of his youth to kind of a benign looking old granddad. And he's still very much a fixture in Rome. He's very often at the Profondo Rosso shop that he and Luigi Cozzi opened up back in the 1980s. That shop is still going strong, and Cozzi mans the desk there many days of the week, and Argento will come in usually around Halloween time to sign autographs, and people still know who he is over there. He never connected in the US quite the same way. I think that was one of the reasons why trying to come to America and make movies here was just destined to fail, because the movies are just too weird. I don't think American audiences have quite the same patience for that type of thing as European audiences do.
One last thing. As you've said, a lot of people tend to stop at opera. If you could give out just a couple of recommendations of films that you feel like post-opera are worth highlighting.
I love his Half of Two Evil Eyes. It's an adaptation of The Black Cap, and it's basically a compendium of Poe. It just reflects his fascination and obsession with Edgar Allan Poe. It stars Harvey Keitel, who's terrific in it, plays a character named Rod Usher. He's a photographer. It's very much based on Ouija, the notorious photographer who specialized in crime scene photos. I think that's a brilliant little film. It was shot in Pittsburgh, about an hour and a half from where I'm sitting right now. To my mind, as much as I love George Romero always kind of favored a kind of anonymity with his landscape in his films, whereas Argento captures the Pittsburgh kind of style and look and skyline better in that 1 hour long presentation. I think that's fantastic. I love the Stendhal Syndrome, which was his big return to Italy. Very violent, more realistically violent, deals more with psychological violence and sexualized violence, which is very disturbing, but I think a beautiful film. Those are two films right there that I would highly recommend. And his other American Giallo, his film Trauma, I've never understood why people don't like that movie. I think it's wonderful. So those are a few for you.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Reelone was recorded at Open Stage Media Studios, directed and edited by Zebulon Schmidt, and produced by Paul Kazee.